Our discussion today will be chronological. It will be from the early settlements of the mid-19th century into the contemporary times. Presentation is not broken into particular categories, although we will touch categories. We will also touch some national events that had strong implications on Arizona, and eventually we'll get into two important Supreme Court decisions indigenous to Arizona that have very strong national implications. So we're going to talk about, excuse me, racial injustice and civil rights as it applies to the state of Arizona. The settlement of Arizona in the mid-19th century was almost non-existent, simply because the land was so barren and so inhospitable that people, especially the image in the upper left, people who ventured across the country totally avoided Arizona simply because it was not conducive to agriculture. And agriculture obviously supports the land. So Arizona was part of Mexico until it was ceded to the United States in 1848 as a result of the Gadsden Purchase. Both Arizona and New Mexico came into the jurisdiction of the United States at that time as one territory, and eventually they became separated. But it's interesting to note that the territory that we consider as Arizona now actually had the beginnings of a Southern mentality and a Southern influence. You can see the image on the right that indicates that it had a leading toward the Confederate States of America, although there was hardly any settlement in this area. And also the furthest west battle of the American Civil War took place right here, just north of Tucson. Right, and how troops wound up in the Arizona desert, I have no idea. I mean, thousands of miles away from the principal theaters on the East Coast. But it's interesting to note that Arizona did begin to develop some kind of Southern mentality, because when we consider Arizona and New Mexico, the territories essentially together, the furthest east state to New Mexico was Texas, and they were part of the Confederacy during the American Civil War. So as a result, we can begin to see the mentality seeping westward eventually into the territories that were ceded to the United States in the mid-19th century. When the settlements began, settlements began to emerge, this is what was found here. The Native Americans, and we'll talk about the treatment and the stereotypical characterization of Native Americans as we get closer into the late 19th and into the early 20th century. The territory of Arizona, as the map indicates, in 1881 was divided into essentially the counties that we know today. Maricopa County was created, Yuma County to the west, and so forth. And some of the early settlements are indicated in the image in the west. Again, the land was so barren and so desolate that it could not support agriculture, and excuse me, as a result, there was hardly any settlement. One of the principal factors and catalysts for some development in Arizona took place actually in neighboring California. As a result of the gold rush in 1848, there was a tremendous amount of interest, obviously, in speculation. Northern California grew exponentially because of the discovery of gold, and then individuals who actually came believed that there were other deposits in the west of gold, silver, lead, and Arizona did eventually become important in terms of mining relative to copper, some gold and some lead, and then tremendous lead deposits were found north of Arizona in the present state of Nevada. So mining and cattle ranching began to develop by the late 1880s, and here are some of the early images. A territorial jail, for example, in 1860, and Tucson and money that was minted in Tucson, yet under the jurisdiction of the United States. One of the early acts of relative to civil rights in Arizona took place by this particular body. This is the 25th Arizona Territorial Assembly, essentially made up of Democrats. Now the political leanings in the late 19th and early 20th century, Republicans were essentially progressive, and Democrats who were usually conservative. And that mentality has certainly switched to present-day politics. But this was a group of essentially Democratic lawmakers in territorial Arizona. Keep in mind, Arizona did not join the Union until 1912. There were a number of pieces of legislation passed by the 25th Arizona Territorial Assembly. The most important was to segregate students, and they were identified as African students who would be separated in terms of its education from the general population. That was put on the books in 1909. We can see some of the later images. But the man on the left, John Kibbe, was the territorial governor of Arizona at the time of the 25th Assembly. He vetoed the legislation that separated the schools and created African students in a separate environment. The legislature, however, overrode his veto. And so beginning with territorial Arizona, there was a mandate to separate students based on race in the elementary school levels. It was not mandated at the high school level. That's an important consideration, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Kibbe arrived in Florence, Arizona, as a result of so many others with health issues, became a prominent lawyer working with corporate law and water rights after he left the governorship. So Kibbe vetoes the measure by the 25th legislature, but it's overridden, and so de facto segregation in Arizona becomes the law of the land. There were a number of factors that helped to create, if we talk about African American students, then going back to the previous images that we saw, when the settlers arrived, they found Native Americans here, obviously. So there were two considerable factors that developed in terms of creating a stereotypical image of Native Americans that led to a very important decision we'll get to in a second. The first are the Indian Wars, and the image on the left is we all know, George Armstrong Custer, who was defeated on June 25th, 1876 in southwestern Montana, and the image on the right indicates the scene. When the reports of Custer's demise reached the powerful Eastern press, they were replete with stereotypical images of what had happened that day in southeastern Montana, that Custer and his men were wiped out by bloodthirsty savages that had to be extricated. That image was clearly reinforced by Custer's widow, Elizabeth Bacon Custer, who lived until the 1930s and a good 60 years after the battle. She promoted Custer, her husband, as a gallant, heroic figure who met an untimely and violent death. And those kinds of images, along with the newspaper reports, began to create an image of Native Americans as a kind of people that had to be subdued, subjugated, or eradicated. So if we see this in the print and in verbal dialogue, especially through Custer's widow, the images become very real through the lens of Andrew Russell. Russell was a photographer, and his most famous photograph is the one on the right, Promontory Point, Utah, in 1869, the meeting of the Transcontinental Railroad. Russell was born in Massachusetts in 1829, left with his family to central New York State, and during the American Civil War, he mustered a regiment out of Albany, New York. Russell was an artist by trade, but during the war, he learned photography and became an important photographer, and was the only officer of the Union Army to actually photograph during the war. The more well-known photographers of the period, Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, are all well known. Russell is an important photographer because he was a member of the military and not a civilian at the time. After the war, Russell gains employment as a photographer for the Union Pacific Railroad. And his job is to photograph the construction of the railroad until they meet a promontory point in Utah. In addition to photographing the railroad construction, he also wanders off into the landscape. And the image on the left are Native Americans that he photographs. And he photographs many Native Americans as well as the topography of the land. So for the first time, the words and the description of what happened to Custer and others now become visualized as a result of Russell's photographs. So we begin to see how words and photographs come together to create a particular stereotype. We can see by the image on the left that the dress and the environment clearly different. And so it reinforces the kinds of things that were already presented relative to those who had lived here before. So if there was a growing sentiment against Native Americans, it was personified by this man. Richard Henry Pratt was born in Vermont in 1840, moved to Indiana with his family in the 1850s and 60s, had a regiment of Indiana volunteers during the American Civil War, and when the war ended, he moved west and became involved in Indian affairs. But it was Pratt, based on his observations and some of the things that we have already talked about, decided that the only good Native American was one who could become Christianized. And so the image, right here on the top, characterizes his approach and his particular method of westernizing, and it's probably a poor term, but probably one that would have credence, is to create a school where you capture the kids and the children at an early age so they begin to develop relative to your own particular criteria. You can tell by the copy here, his particular aim. Eventually what happened is that the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1879 is created as the first Indian school in the United States and really becomes the catalyst for cultural genocide. So Pratt starts the Carlisle Indian School, and by the 1870s and 1880s, we begin to see the emergence of the boarding school. And we can see how the images especially on the right, personified Pratt's particular objective. What's interesting to note is that when the kids came to the Indian schools, they were completely immersed within Christian values. They were not allowed to speak their language. There were no customs. There was no history, no dress. And you can see the images on the right, how Pratt and the others began to view Native Americans in terms of great assimilation into the American experience. Within Native American cultures, hair was an important part of their personality. You can see the images up here where some had actually retained that particular status, and here images were completely cut to form the perspective and the image that Pratt and others wanted to convey. The dress was essentially the same. You can see by the image on the left. They were all cookie cutter kinds of experiences, and especially with the boys here, especially with the boys here in this particular image, you can tell, and we talked about the importance of hair within Native American culture, that was completely stripped of their personality and of their dignity. So if the Carlisle School developed in 1879 as the most important Indian boarding school, The image on the left is the second most important, and that's in Phoenix, Arizona. So this is the Indians boarding school that developed in Phoenix, Indian School Road, right? So the campus began in 1891, 21 years prior to Arizona entering the Union. There were 42 buildings over a 10-acre site, about 3 miles north of the present central business district of Phoenix. And there was a very complete division of labor. The girls were put in for domestic reasons, and the boys were put in for vocational and business reasons. Children were taken from their parents, from their native villages, and taken for months at a time, some for years at a time. And for those who have had the opportunity, and I certainly would encourage you to go to the Heard Museum downtown. There's a terrific gallery devoted to Indian boarding schools in the Heard Museum. I certainly would encourage those to see that, and it's much more informative than we can present here in just a few minutes. At the height of the Phoenix Indian boarding school in 1921, there were 23 different tribes from 22 states that were taken and put into this facility. And here we can begin to see the Indian school band, for example. Do we see any Native American instruments in here? Parents had to sign a consent for them to go. They were signed under very coercive conditions, but essentially they were taken directly from their homes and put into these schools so they could become Americanized, so to speak. So this is one example of that particular practice and that particular form of probably, for lack of a better term, probably an imprisonment. So we see many of the instruments that are in a marching band today, but do we see any Native American instruments? No, because it goes back to what we had talked about before, that any elements of their culture and of their history were completely taken away, and under penalty, if they were to speak their language or to exhibit any of their customs or history, under punishment. And this was the effect of the boarding schools. The rights of individuals did not come until almost in the late 20th century. So Phoenix begins to develop between the wars, and as we had talked about, primarily as a southern, within a southern mentality. And the community in Arizona was essentially absolved from the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws created segregation in the states that had been part of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And so because Arizona was not a state, that they were not terribly affected by the extreme segregation laws that were put on the books in the southern United States. Yet, however, in the image on the lower right still indicates, because of the Latin American influence in this area and the Hispanic and Latino influence, that certainly African Americans and Latinos were considered within the same class. Well, we talked about how sparsely the area was populated, and in fact, we had talked about Governor Kibbe at one time, that he advocated separating New Mexico from Arizona because of the water issue, and that he did not feel that it was proper to share the water, for example, in the Colorado Basin with New Mexico. So that was, but in terms of the settlement in the late 19th century, essentially mining and ranching and the small communities that developed around those industries, such as Bisbee and Jerome, for example. The population in Arizona in 1890 was 89,000. In 1910, the block population was considered at 11,134, which 10% were Hispanic, 4% were Black, and 1% was Chinese. Those are the figures that I was able to to discover. So if we talked about Arizona being developed, or Arizona and Phoenix within a Southern mentality, this man was a personification of that. This was, if you pulled out your dictionary and pulled up the word racist, his picture would be there. This is Benjamin Moore, who was governor of Arizona between 1933 and 1937. Born in Decker, Tennessee, he arrived in Tempe in the late 19th century as a physician, settled in Tempe, and for about a 35-year period, delivered most of the babies in Tempe at the time. But he was also an ardent segregationist and a racist. There's a quote here that's attributed to him. When Moore was governor in 1935, he had this one comment. At a news conference in 1935, he opposed black migration to Arizona and said, "As governor of Arizona, I do not suppose to allow this state to be a dumping ground." He was also a member of the Arizona Constitutional Convention in 1910, when the Constitution was being constructed in preparation for statehood. And so that particular language gave credence to a particular editorial comment in the Arizona Republican in 1915 by an African-American, Frank Smith. Not that the name means anything, but Smith wrote in the 1915 letter to the editorial page, "There is more race hatred right here in Phoenix to the square inch than any other city that I have lived." And that was 20 years before Moore became governor, but still, his approach, his thinking, and his mentality helped to really create a very divided area. This is Phoenix as it developed in the 1930s. And the image on the right really doesn't apply that much to Phoenix, although we did talk about the limitations of Jim Crowism in Arizona, simply because Arizona was not a state that was not part of the Confederacy that had, according to state officials, an obligation to maintain that kind of Southern mentality and to separate all facilities. During World War II, the Arizona and Phoenix areas developed as an important training base for the military during World War II, specifically for aviation, because of large tracts of unoccupied land, low taxes, cheap labor, and a very close proximity to aviation centers in California. There were training centers that developed outside of Phoenix, and one that was named after this man. Briefly, Frank Luke was shot down in Germany in 1918, and the air base in Litchfield has his name. Also, the air base, the Luke Air Base, was also an important training facility for this man on the right. This is Eleanor and Lincoln Ragsdale, who become early civil rights leaders right after World War II, particularly Ragsdale. Ragsdale was born in Oklahoma, joined the military at the start of World War II, and becomes part of the Tuskegee Airmen during training in the Arizona desert. Ragsdale does not fly any combat missions during World War II, but becomes an important part of the discussion relative to the Tuskegee Airmen. Ragsdale relates a story that when he first joined the military, he was sent to Mississippi, and he had a car with him, and was driving one day and needed to stop for gas and oil, and the mechanic saw that here was a black man driving a car in Mississippi in 1940. Alerts the local officials. They eventually catch up to him, pull him over, and begin to threaten him dramatically. And at that point, Ragsdale thought that his life was in jeopardy, but one of the police officers saw that he had a military uniform on, and he let him go. And he thought, and Ragsdale relates at a later time, that he never felt more threatened in a racist society than being pulled over simply because of the color of his skin. There he is on the right. He becomes an important part of the civil rights movement in Arizona after World War II, and what really galvanizes Ragsdale, and there he is speaking, and anyone recognize the image on the right? That's exactly right. So what really galvanizes Ragsdale in terms of his civil rights participation, after the war, he becomes a funeral director and has a mortuary business. In the early 50s, there was a African-American soldier who was killed in the Korean War. So from the Phoenix area, so they come back to Ragsdale's mortuary and he prepares him for burial. Except the cemetery will not take the black soldier. You're not burying a black soldier in my cemetery. Ragsdale was incensed. And by this time, President Truman had desegregated the armed forces. Remember, his declaration in 1948 integrated the United States military. So Ragsdale contacts the White House, and Truman sends a colonel out to the cemetery, and it's all resolved, and the soldier receives a proper military burial. But it's not until Ragsdale raises his voice to President Truman does that happen. And you can tell here by his comment. As a result of the mandate by the 25th legislature, the schools become segregated in Phoenix, and decisions are coming. In 1951, there were 3 students, and let me get their names because they are important. 3 African-American students, Robert Phillips, Tolly Williams, and David Clark, seek entrance into the Phoenix Public High School in 1951. So they bring their case before this man, Fred Struckmeyer, Jr., who sits on the Arizona Superior Court. The 3 African-American students then take counsel with Hazel Daniels, the first African-American to graduate from the University of Arizona Law School, and Herbert Finn, a Jewish attorney. And they represent the 3 students to integrate the Phoenix Public Schools in 1951. The case becomes in front of Struckmeyer in 1953. I want to get to Daniels in a second. This is Daniels. This is one of the 2 attorneys that pursued the case before Struckmeyer. Struckmeyer then declares that segregation is unlawful and it violates the 14th Amendment under the Equal Protection. And in 1953, issues an order for the Phoenix High School to and I want to get the proper to enjoin the Phoenix Union High School from continuing its practice. Just before Struckmeyer has his decision, he calls Daniels and Finn into his chambers, and he's about to sign his opinion. And Daniels has this one quote about him. He had witnessed Struckmeyer with his pen in hand and saying that, and this is Daniels speaking, the man was crying. He was actually crying when he wrote his opinion and said, 50 years of this is way too long. So the Phoenix public schools, the high schools, become desegregated in 1953. Keep in mind, this was just at the high school level. So, but not in elementary. So the elementary schools then, so Daniels and Finn go before Charles Bernstein about a year later. Bernstein is the first Jewish judge in Arizona and concurs with Struckmeyer's opinion that segregation at the elementary school level violated the 14th Amendment under the Equal Protection, and again enjoins the Phoenix School District from continuing its practice. So between the decisions of Struckmeyer and Bernstein, schools in Phoenix are integrated. And so we don't see this picture any longer. This is 1950, this is just before 3 African-American students go before Bernstein and go before Struckmeyer. When Thurgood Marshall, who later became a justice to the United States Supreme Court, represented Brown before the U.S. Supreme Court, 2 weeks before the court rendered its decision, and as Thurgood Marshall was delivering his closing comments, he had Bernstein's decision in his hand when addressing the court. And then the court unanimously, back here, image on the lower left, 9-0, that to overturn, essentially what the court did was overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. That was the case in 1896 that said that separate but equal is equal. And the court said, no, it's not, and ruled 9-0 that separate but equal is not equal. And as a result, open accommodations throughout the United States for all people. There is also the injustice done to Dr. King in terms of honoring his birthday. There were a couple of pieces of legislation that addressed this issue, one of which was to create a national celebration having Dr. King, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln all together celebrating on a Sunday, not a paid holiday. People didn't like that at all. And in 1992, the NFL threatened, because Dr. King would not be honored in Arizona, that they threatened to pull the Super Bowl in 1992, which eventually they did. And that game was played in the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. At the same time, a referendum passed in Arizona to create the third Monday in January is Dr. Martin Luther King Day. And so Arizona joined the rest of the union almost pulling and dragging in terms of honoring Dr. King, where the rest of the nation had done that before. So if we talked about the experiences of Native Americans, the segregation in the Phoenix public schools, how that issue was resolved. There was also discrimination against Jewish people in Arizona, primarily through the efforts of the man and the woman on the right. This is Jack Stewart and his wife. Jack Stewart was the manager of the Camelback Inn, currently in Scottsdale. Stewart was a sports writer from North Dakota that, like so many other people, eventually migrated because of health to Arizona, found his way into the hospitality industry, and made acquaintance with John C. Lincoln. Lincoln was an Ohio entrepreneur who also came to this area because of health reasons for his wife. Stewart convinced Lincoln to put up $200,000, and Lincoln had a remote site well north of Scottsdale for a particular facility. And Stewart said, why don't we have a lavish facility that we can attract celebrities and personalities and make it one of the great destinations in America. However, we would exclude African Americans, Native Americans, and Jews. We'll keep it strictly within a Christian environment. And that's essentially what happened for a period of time until an experience in the early 1950s changed everything. There was a Cleveland businessman, Ed Vosburg, V-O-S-B-U-R-G, who wanted to stay at the Camelback Inn. And Stewart looked at his had his room reservation and I thought it was, well, it was a Jewish sounding name. Vosburg, V-O-S-B-U-R-G, Vosburg. It was from Cleveland. And Stewart said, well, we're going to put you through an extensive questionnaire. And Vosburg eventually said, you know what, it's not worth it, I'm not going to go. But because he had a Jewish sounding name, that he was denied a room at the Camelback Inn. The Anti-Defamation League begins to investigate both the Camelback Inn and also the Hot Springs in Virginia for anti-Semitic and discriminatory practices. Another individual who was denied a room was Leverett Saltonstall, who was a senator from Massachusetts. He was denied a room for various and sundry reasons that was not fully explained. But eventually the Anti-Defamation League goes after Stewart by saying that you have to open your facility to all people. And eventually he does. And Stewart says, we were under extreme pressure from the Anti-Defamation League to change our policy of guest selection. But the ADL countered, it would be wonderful if the ADL could pressure all discriminants into a path of decency. It isn't that easy. Mr. Stewart put heat on himself when he said one thing and he meant something else completely. So eventually in 1968, Stewart, who gained acquisition of the property, Lincoln actually sold shares of the Camelback Inn to him, and eventually he became owner. And he sells it to the Marriott Corporation in 1968. However, by the time he sells it in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the Jewish population of Phoenix is about 21,000. And one of the great early Jewish attorneys in Arizona is Rose Silver. Rose Silver was born in Austria. No one really knew what year it was, but she became the first woman graduate from the University of Arizona Law School in 1930, and has a practice in Tucson, and later becomes an important administrator in Pinal County. Rose Silver's claim as an important early attorney is in association with John Dillinger, which is an interesting story. Right out of law school, Rose gains a job with a Tucson law firm, and Dillinger and his gang are attempting to escape authorities, and eventually they wind up in Tucson, Arizona. They're in a hotel that actually burns down, and part of his posse is recognized and identified, and Dillinger is captured. So he goes into the law office and says that I need representation to address the extradition back to Indiana. So the partner was out playing pool at that time, and Rose comes in and says, well, I could take the case. So Rose Silver takes the case of John Dillinger, but she loses, and he's eventually extradited back to Indiana. So as a gift, Dillinger gives her $1,500 and a brand new 1929 or 30, whatever year it was, or 32, Packard automobile. So Rose has a couple of kids and carts them around, and eventually the back seats get stained. You have kids, right? Ice cream, ketchup, and they rip the seats. So Rose was married to an attorney, James, as well. And James, one of his clients, had a gas station along with an upholstery shop and a furniture store. So one day Rose drives her Packard in and says, you know, this is really ripped up. It's full of stains. Can you please change the upholstery in the back? And he said, sure, we'll do that. A day or two later, Rose gets a call and said, Rose, I'm about to fix your car, the back seat. Do you know what's there? Rose says, I don't have any idea. What Dillinger did was to hide from the authorities. He put his entire arsenal in the back seat. Machine guns, magazines, ammunition, pistols, just to hide him from the authorities, and he throws it in the back seat of his lawyer's automobile. But Rose became an important part of Pinal County administration and had a very strong and vibrant a vibrant voice throughout Arizona. There's also Gene and Betty Fairfax, important civil rights leaders in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Both are educators, originally from Cleveland. Gene was first, followed by her sister Betty, and left an indelible mark on education in Arizona in terms of fostering opportunities for all students. Gene Fairfax died fairly recently in 2019, but their legacy is based on a foundation. I want to get it correctly. With her sister Jean, Betty established the Dan and Inez Wood Fairfax Fund at Southern Education Foundation and endowed the Betty H. Fairfax Fund for Education Equality at the Arizona Community Foundation. So both Gene and Betty were important educators and civil rights advocates in the late 20th and early 20th centuries in Arizona. So if we talked about the Bernstein and Struckmeyer decisions having important national implications, certainly this one is just as important. This is Ernesto Miranda, who was arrested in 1963 on charges of robbery and rape. The Miranda case is not terribly complicated. However, he is coerced into having a confession that he committed crimes against a particular individual. I'm sorry, I want to get this right. Kidnapping, rape, and armed robbery. That was his confession. So he is arrested, and he confesses to the crime. However, his attorneys say that he was coerced into his confession. Goes before the Arizona Supreme Court. They uphold the lower court decision. They then appeal to the United States Supreme Court. And the bullet on the bottom says that the court disagreed with Miranda and upheld his conviction. Well, his conviction then is appealed to the United States Supreme Court. And the Miranda warning is then issued in the Earl Warren Court in a 5-4 decision that the confession by Miranda is thrown out because it was coercive, and that any individual that is taken into law enforcement custody must be given their right to an attorney, and also must be given their right under the Fifth Amendment in terms of their civic responsibility. The Miranda case in 1966, we know has had a profound implication on law enforcement and private citizens in this country, and is really one of the foundations of individual civil rights going forward. Miranda then was taken back into Arizona, read his rights, and was convicted again. However, he was paroled after a short period of time, and actually was stabbed to death in a bar in Phoenix in 1975. So as important as his case was as colorful as his demise. But the Miranda case, as well as the segregation cases in Arizona, leave us with a very important message that Arizona had a very clear and important influence on national affairs. And the court decision of 5-4 again reinforces individual rights, that they cannot be coerced into making a confession without the presence of an attorney and without full knowledge of their constitutional responsibilities and constitutional rights. Another group that suffered dramatically in terms of the compromise of civil rights and civil responsibilities were Japanese Americans, especially during World War II. The internment camps, there were around 15 around the country, and we'll see a map in a second, but there were 2 in Arizona, one in Gila River and the other in Poston, near Yuma. The image on the right is the one in Poston, And the land had been occupied by Native Americans for centuries. When the U.S. government came in and said, we're going to build these barracks for Japanese Americans, the Native American response was, well, you're going to do to the Japanese Americans what you did to us, and we're not leaving. So the U.S. government said, yes, you are, and they forced them off the land to build the barracks here. This is a map of the relocation camps throughout the country. You can see the two in Arizona. Outside of California, there were two small ones in Arkansas, but outside of California, Arizona had the most at 2. The one in Manzanar is probably the most well-known. The one in Northern California, Tule Lake, had the greatest number, over 19,000 that were interned in Tule Lake. These camps were established in 1942. And I have the population for the ones here in Arizona. The one in Poston had a population of 17,814. That opened in May of 1942. The one in Gila River had a population of 13,348. That also opened in July of 1942. The one in Manzanar, that is still, it is a Natural Historic Site for those who have visited there. 10,046, that opened in August of 1942. And the one in Northern California in Tule Lake was the largest. It had a population of almost 19,000, and that opened in May of 1942. There were 18 altogether that interned Japanese Americans. Barracks are on the left, and the barbed wire kept the population within a specific geographic area. This is the one in Gila River. And very similar to the image on the left, in terms of its construction, the remoteness of the location, as opposed to the camps that the Nazis had during World War II, were essentially existing facilities. For example, the one in Auschwitz in Poland was an old Polish military barrack. But here, these facilities were constructed solely to intern Japanese Americans. There was agriculture. The image on the lower left is a monument, and trying to keep life as responsible. I hate to use the term normal, but the image on the upper left, a baseball game within the camp. This image, to me, personifies the dichotomy within American thinking. This is a Japanese American family that was interned. Their son is with them. And they're holding a picture of their other son who is fighting for the United States. So here you have the most blatant dichotomy of behavior, where you have internment of parents and then those that were supporting the military effort. Japanese Americans who fought in World War II were the most decorated of any combat battalion. And despite discrimination, you can see the image in the upper left, Japanese Americans capturing a Nazi flag. But just take a look at the numbers of the 442nd Division of Japanese soldiers. They were the most decorated in U.S. military history. And the same with because we had talked about Lincoln Ragsdale and the Tuskegee Airmen. If you take a look at some of the numbers that were generated by the achievements and accomplishments of the Tuskegee Airmen, of the 355 pilots that were deployed, almost 100, that's one of almost every 3 Tuskegee Airmen were decorated during the war. An extraordinary number. And when you consider that of the Japanese Americans that fought in the war, almost 10,000 received Purple Hearts. And yet, if you see the soldiers, the image in the upper left, and their moms and dads were interned in camps, and they go on to become decorated heroes during the war. To me, the dichotomy just remains astounding. So if we've addressed integration in the Phoenix schools, and if we addressed a very one-sided approach to Americanization of Native Americans on the right, is the dialogue finished? Does the conversation continue? And so that's really the basis of our dialogue today. That we have seen what has happened to various groups. We've talked about consequences, but is the conversation really over? Are the conditions really set at a particular level that we have a responsibility and an obligation to all the people to recognize the value of each individual? So is the conversation over? Should we continue the conversation right now? Should we walk outside into the community and continue it? Do we continue it in the voting booth? Do we continue it in the courts? I see heads nodding here, and I would agree that the conversation is far from over.